Hey, vinyl community. So, doing this on my phone, so if it seems a little bit awkward, maybe, maybe it is. I usually do it on my computer, but I think the sound is better on my phone. Wanted to add to the asset archive, so I was going through that list, and I found a couple records there that have been important to me. And I'm surprised. I looked around a little bit, and I didn't see that they had been done yet. So if they have been done, I apologize, but wanted to do the first two Sonics records. And that's Sonic's first album, 1965, and that's the next one in 66. Now, the difference between, I think, the Sonics and a lot of bands that you're going to find on that Acid Archives list are that the Sonics are a little bit more on the garage sound side of that list of bands. What they have in common would be that they had that rawness, and they had that independent streak, that indie sound where they were creating something completely different than what had come before. If there was a band that inspired the Sonics, there used to be a band in the late 50s called the Fabulous Wailers. And the Wailers, or the Fabulous Wailers, were real early kind of proponents of the original rock and roll sound, that sound of Little Richard, and the sound of Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, and those early sunnier stuff, and that it was the rawness. Rock and roll was moving away from that sound and becoming more, well, what would we eventually get? Sgt. Pepper. So it was moving more in an artsy kind of way. And while there were certainly, good aspects of that, there was some loss of the real passion and fight that early, watch an early performance of Jerry Lee Lewis, and or watch a little performance of, my favorite, which was Little Richard, and see the power of those performances, and then you can see where, the Sonics wanted to take things. And on these first two records, 1965, they didn't worry a lot about, one thing that you read a lot when you read about the Sonics is that they, on both these first two early albums, they used one mic on the drum kit. And that was part of how they were creating that sound. I'm sure they were doing it just because, well, one, I'm sure finances was an issue and they didn't have a lot of things in the studio, but they were specifically, because they had been inspired by the Wailers and they wanted to take that sound someplace new. The band was specifically seeking a raw rock and roll sound. There's a story about them being in the studio when they recorded these first two records, and they're in the studio, and there's soundproofing on the walls of the studio, and they thought that it was taking away from the sound that they wanted to create. So the band took it upon themselves to tear the soundproofing down from the walls so they could retain that. They didn't want their sound softened by that sound, and so you could see there was a real intent on their part, and that's an intention that would go on. The Sonics and the Wailers, for that matter, become real influential. There were, as we went into the 1970s, and we started to see bands like, I'm going to be sensitive to everybody's tastes and likes, but you saw bands like Jethro Tull and you know, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, who were taking rock music, especially, into a different direction, and something the Sonics would not have approved of. But there was another band in the '70s called the Flaming Groovies, and the Groovies were big, you know, proponents of that early sound, and they carried the torch in those tough years in the early and mid '70s. Before, you know, eventually what happens is there's a punk happens, and so you have bands like the Ramones and the Heartbreakers and even the New York Dolls, who were more glam, but they certainly were going for a much more stripped down, you know, rock and roll sound than what was, you know, big in the pages of Rolling Stone magazine. And then, you know, of course, there's a great interview with Malcolm McLean where he talks about that his main focus isn't the music. His main focus is to make sure that there's, you know, there's a sense of freedom and anarchy in the air. And he says, if you have that, the music will grow from it, you know. So he goes, I don't worry about the band creating great music, because if you create the right atmosphere, the great music will happen. And I thought that was kind of a cool, say what you want about McLean, but, you know, he could come up with some pretty interesting things. There's a third Sonics record. On their third one, they switched record labels, and it's reported that the label put them under a lot of pressure to come up with a sound that was more commercial and more, you know, with some potential hits. And they certainly softened the sound of the band. And there's moments in it that that third album is worth hearing for sure. But there's strings and some brass in there, I believe, and it's really not the same band anymore. And they took away that thing that made these records so amazing and so special. They managed to take that away. The Sonics were a band that I discovered. Just a few examples. So when I was like finding like the early Who stuff, even like Love, especially the early singles, for sure, the Elevators, you know, all of these albums came on my radar right around that same time. And even, you know, a band that later became known for, this is, you know, Pipers, but to me this is, you know, far and away the best Pink Floyd record. In fact, I would say I only own 3 Pink Floyd records, so you can guess which ones. But they all those records that I showed had a love for that early stripped down sound. That it doesn't mean, you know, you listen to the 13th Floor Elevators, it doesn't mean you can't be creative and make interesting music. It just means that you balance that out a little bit and not lose some of the edge that was there in that early rock and roll, and keep looking back to those performances of Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis and all that for inspiration and a lot of that. McLean too, in his interview, talks about like if you lose that, you know, then there is no point to rock and roll. He said that if you lose that rawness, then it's a meaningless art form. And I don't know if I agree with that, but it's certainly interesting to consider. Anyway, I thought I'd cover those. If somebody's already done the Sonics, could be pretty popular. I think people recognize them. You can read lots of interviews with like Kurt Cobain, where he talks about both the Wailers and the Sonics as being early inspirations for him on what he on the sound that he particularly liked that idea that the Sonics used one microphone on the drum kit to make sure that the sound was, and then of course then you'd have Steve Albany come along, and that whole sound that he wanted, which was to capture that live rawness. So if you don't know these records, I'll do yourself a favor and grab both of them. Mine are originals. I think they're both late 80s pressings. Well, this might be a 90s pressing, and I think this is a late 80s pressing. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that, and if you don't know the Sonics, I highly recommend them, and the Flaming Groovies, and that'll lead you right into, you know, where punk is going by the time we get into the, you know, the late 70s and that. All right, gang, hope you enjoyed that. Take it easy.